Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, as always, Ricardo Lopes, and today we're joined by Dr. Joshua Tucker. He's a professor of politics and director of the Center for Social Media and Politics at New York University. For most of his career, he studied comparative politics with an emphasis on mass politics, including elections and voting, the development of partisan attachment, public opinion formation, and political protest, as well as how social media usage affects all of these types of political behavior. More recently, he has been spending a lot of time working on studying the relationship between social media politics and political participation, and those are the topics we're going to be talking about today. So, Dr. Tucker, welcome to the show. It's a pleasure to have you on.
Thank you so much, Ricardo. It's a pleasure to be here.
Okay, so is social media used by politicians to try to set political agendas, and is that something that is possible to study using social media data?
Yeah, so absolutely, politicians are trying. Politicians across the world, across the board, are trying to use social media in order to set the agenda. Right? No one so more than President Trump in the United States, but there are lots of people who imitate him in that regard. It has become a tool in the toolkit of almost all politicians. It's hard to imagine especially in the United States, but in other countries as well, that people would try to carry out campaigns without using social media. Now, the question of whether or not politicians are able to use social media to look at go beyond just mere campaigning, but actually to do kind of agenda setting, is a super interesting question. And we actually worked in the Center for Social Media and Politics. We've done a couple of different studies, one that's been published, one that's under review right now, where we have tried to use social media data to get at a sort of new angle at the kind of age-old questions around political representation, right? And whether or not politicians are actually reacting to the concerns of their followers, or politicians are sort of leading their followers, right? This has been a long debate. There's been lots of formal work on this, lots of empirical work on this, but we thought that social media offered a new opportunity to try to study this. So this is basically what we went about doing. And I'll talk, the paper that's already been published in the American Political Science Review is called Who Leads, Who Follows, and it looks at the national level. The work we're doing right now is looking at the sub-national level. So I'll explain what we're doing at the national level. What we were able to do is collect loads and loads of tweets by members of the US Congress. So we got a lot of tweets from members of the US Congress. Then we collected tweets from people who we called interested, people who were interested in politics, who followed enough members of US Congress to be interested in politics. And we were able to subdivide those two into people who seemed like they were more on the Republican side of the spectrum and more on the Democratic side of the spectrum. And then we also collected tweets from a random sample of the US population. And then we used topic models to try to figure out what topics the members of, we sort of modeled the data to figure out what topics the politicians were talking about. And then we were able to take those same topics and look at the extent to which members of the mass public were talking about it, and particular followers of the politicians were talking about it. And then what we were able to do is sort of look at the timing of these topics and be able to look at the relationship between when topics were raised by the public and when topics were raised by politicians. And at the national level, one of the interesting things we found is that politicians did seem to respond to the public more than the public was responding to politicians, which, it's one thing that we're looking at here, which was super interesting and kind of exciting from a democratic accountability standpoint. But we also found that what they were responding to was their own partisans. So they were more likely to be responding to the people who voted for them. So if they were Republican politicians, more likely to be responding to Republicans. We're now replicating this work at the state level. And what we've done is we've collected state level data where we're looking at this across 15 US states that we selected for a variety of characteristics, and have replicated the same exact process of collecting this data from state legislatures, from people who live in those states, from people who live in those states and follow the state legislatures, so at the subnational level. So stay tuned for that in the future.
Right. Yeah, that's very interesting. But I wanted to ask you, How do you go about distinguishing this sort of influence operations on social media from organic social media activity?
That's a fantastic question. So just to like inform listeners a little bit, influence operations are, any attempt to try to set the agenda, as we're talking about, right? So we can think of influence operations as being totally benign, right? Like you have a grassroots political movement. They want people to talk more about minimum wage. And so they sort of coordinate how are they going to run a social media strategy. If you think of any communications firm, this is what they're often, advising people about. How do you kind of set the agenda? But we can also think about these coordinated influence operations as being very nefarious, right? So we can think about coordinated influence operations that are run by, say, foreign governments trying to pretend and mask themselves to look like they're domestic actors. So the sort of quintessential example of this in the United States was that in the aftermath of the 2016 U.S. elections, it was discovered that there was the Internet Research Agency in Russia, as well as organizations in Venezuela and China and Iran, were all trying to run these kind of influence operations over the course of the 2016 U.S. election. And there was a lot of academic research on trying to figure out what on earth they were doing with these influence operations. And we have some new research where we've been looking at what was the impact of these influence operations. But your question is, how do we discover, right, that people are acting in these coordinated influence campaigns? So the truth of the matter, and this gets to a much larger question that I suspect will come up repeatedly over the course of our discussion today, which is that as political scientists trying to understand the relationship between social media and politics, we're in a kind of very different situation in terms of our access to data than we've ever been before in kind of the history of political science. So as you mentioned before, I studied mass political behavior before I started studying social media in post-communist countries. How would I study mass political behavior in post-communist countries? Well, my first book looked at the relationship between the economy and election results. So I went to the countries in question, I collected economic data, I collected election results. Those are known as administrative data. Administrative data are data that are produced by governments or any actors, right, for particular reasons, but that can be analyzed for scholars for other reasons as well. So they have to produce a result of an election to know who gets to go into the parliament. Countries produce economic statistics for a whole host of reasons. That's one type of data that we worked with as political scientists. Another type of data that we worked with as political scientists was when you do mass political behavior is survey data, right? That's data that's created by the social scientists. It has all sorts of problems and concerns. It's expensive, right? We have to deal with how we sample people. You can always know there's no silver bullet in data for social science research, because if there was, everyone would be using it, right? So there's issues with survey. But in both of those cases, either the administrative data, you can collect it from countries and governments and things like that have an obligation to make it public. And of course, I worked in the former communist world. You can question, right, how reliable some of that data was in retrospect, or you have to create your own data. Well, in this case of social media data, right, we're now for the first time finding ourselves in the realm of biologists, right, where a lot of the data that we need to do our studies is actually owned by really gigantic for-profit companies, right, that are trying to make money off of that data and that have all sorts of concerns, right, of which, feeding academic research maybe, is not going to be at the top of their list, although in the last 6 weeks things have changed a little bit, but it's not going to be at the top of their list. And in many cases, it may be something that they don't want to do because it could hurt shareholder value. It could subject them to fines, as Facebook has learned in the past. And so we're in this really weird situation where we don't necessarily have access to the data that we need to do our research. So it's this very strange time to be doing social science research. Because on the one hand, I was just teaching this in my Intro to Comparative Politics class yesterday, right? There are 2.9 billion people who use Facebook monthly, right? That's over a third of the world's population using Facebook monthly. You've got 1 billion people on TikTok, right? You've got hundreds of millions of Twitter users, right? So on the one hand, this is the best of times if you're doing social science research, because there is more data about human behavior and more examples of people leaving behind in electronic format, messages of records of what they were thinking, what they were doing. We have all this network data so we can study who people are associating with, right? It's the best of times for social science research, but it's also oddly the worst of times because we don't necessarily have guaranteed access to that data. That data that we do have access to, it, in a sense, there's a lot of different ways, and we can talk more about this if you're interested, that these sorts of that you get access to this data. But at the end of the day, until governments get involved and compel the social media platforms to share the data with outside researchers, you're always, in a weird way, at the whim of the platforms. Whether it's a technical whim, they change the way that they bundle the data, and all of a sudden months and months of work of how you deal with the data gets taken away, or it can be, legal concerns where for social media platforms, as they have tried to do to my colleagues here at NYU in the Tandon School of Engineering, where the platforms can even come after you legally and try to stop you from collecting data. So this is a roundabout answer to your question, because the answer to the question of how we know about these foreign influence campaigns that took place in 2016 is that Twitter told us these were foreign influence campaigns, that they had found the foreign influence campaigns, and huge kudos to Twitter. They then released this data about these campaigns, and Twitter has been releasing for academic study collections of tweets that they say were produced by foreign influence campaigns. But they won't tell us how they found it, and for good reason, right? Like, these are adversarial relationships. If Twitter comes out and says, oh, these are the 17 things we do to identify a foreign influence campaign, then you can imagine the next foreign influence campaign will come about and try to do things differently to avoid detection in that regard. So as social scientists, or as political scientists who study this, what we have been kind of limited to doing so far, if we want to understand, right, how you can detect influence campaigns. And this is the paper that we published with Jake Shapiro at Princeton on detecting these kind of campaigns. What we're able to do is take the stuff that Twitter gave us and train models to try to, on our end, pick up what features distinguish to data from a foreign influence campaign from data from non-influence campaigns. So what we did in that particular paper was we took data from our random sample of US Twitter users, and then we took the data that Twitter gave us that was said to be part of an influence campaign, and we tried to train machine learning models, to identify the difference between those two. So on the one hand, we can use machine learning, and what we showed in that paper, you could pull out features, right, that would actually do a pretty good job. And we did all sorts of things, like we would train it on a year's worth of data and then see if we could predict the next month. We did all sorts of things to see how it worked and how it didn't work. But at this moment, we're sort of limited in the sense that we're dependent on the platforms to identify the foreign influence campaigns in the first place that we can then use to train our models to do this. Now, maybe you asked a much simpler question, which was just simply how we can identify, people who are working together. And that's this incredibly interesting and exciting field of network analysis, right? And so, just very briefly, what we, again, the data that we used to use primarily in political science, you can think about as fitting on a spreadsheet, right? Like, I would have regions of Poland, and then I would have votes for political parties, unemployment rates. I could put all that into a spreadsheet. Or survey data. You have the respondent to the survey in the row, and then you have all the questions going across the columns. You could fit that in there. What's interesting and exciting about social media data is that we also have this component of, so we still have a user, who produces content and produces likes and ha-has and retweets and things like that. But we also can embed these users in networks. And we can embed a lot of the data around them in networks. So for example, if you're on Twitter, right, you follow people on Twitter. There are people who follow you. We can place people in a network, and we can learn potentially about coordinated activity by looking at what's doing kind of cluster analysis, where you look at these particular networks. But we can also look at that around content, right? So if after this video is finished, you put up a link to the video, I share a link to the video, right? We can see who shares the links to the videos. We can build networks around who shares those things. And so if we want to find people working together, it's a combination of looking at similar content that people are sharing and looking across these networks.
Okay, so changing topics a little bit, but still in the realm of influence, let's say, is it popular when celebrities post about politics on social media?
Yeah, so this is a super interesting question. Clearly, I mean, this is actually a kind of funny thing about social media and politics, is that we get really excited about politicians who are on social media. We get really excited about what's going on. And then you go and look at the Justin Biebers and the Taylor Swifts of the world, and there's just so much more activity going on around celebrities or sports stars and film stars. It's incredible. And so once again, like much like we started with the politicians, clearly celebrities are trying to use social media to increase their brand awareness. And indeed, there are celebrities whose entire brand awareness is that they're on social media, right? This is the rise of the social media influencers. But then the question becomes, right, like how does that play into politics? And we got interested in the lab. We had a PhD student named Jan Zielinski who was thinking about this topic and got kind of curious about how we could figure out what was going on with celebrities. And in the United States, there's this famous quote from Michael Jordan. Now, Michael Jordan, I don't think I have to introduce to anyone, but just in case we have younger viewers, right? Like Michael Jordan, prior to LeBron James, I mean, Michael Jordan would be upset to hear this, right? One of the greatest basketball players in history. I won't weigh in on who are the greatest basketball players in history. Jordan is clearly one of them. You can watch, you can watch old highlights of him. Anyway, Jordan was criticized. He was from North Carolina. He went to college in the University of North Carolina, and he was criticized in the 1990s for not weighing in a particularly nasty Senate race, where you had essentially a candidate, Jesse Helms, who was running for office, and using, if not overtly, then at least very implicitly racist arguments against his campaign, against his opponent, who was a black man. And Jordan was asked, why wouldn't he endorse Helms's opponent in this thing? And Jordan famously said, or probably said, there's a whole minor little history on what exactly he said, which was that Republicans buy sneakers too. And the point being here is that Michael Jordan makes a ton of money, right, off of brand endorsements. But if you think about celebrities, right, and especially if we get outside of the realm of sports stars who have other reasons people are turning in, but we get into entertainers, we get into, just sort of classic film stars, celebrities, right? Like they are going to make money. Let's take a film star. They're going to make money for people turning out and coming to see their movie. A music star. They're going to make money from people coming to their concerts, streaming their albums and stuff like that. It's a kind of interesting puzzle of why would celebrities actually risk alienating some portion of their supporters, right? Like if you, and in the United States, I don't know exactly what the situation is like in Portugal right now, but in the United States, polarization is getting worse. We are a much more polarized country. Like literally our response to wearing masks has gotten caught up in politics and things that you would never have thought would have gotten linked into politics. So we're a polarized country. So it seems like this would be dangerous for celebrities. And so what we did was we actually decided we'd try to investigate this phenomenon and see, was it actually a costly decision for celebrities to get involved in politics? So in the 2016 election, which was Hillary Clinton versus Donald Trump, Jan diligently went through as much as he could of mainstream media to find celebrities who had endorsed one of the candidates, either Trump or Clinton or Bernie Sanders in this election. And then we went and we looked at their tweets about the election campaign. And we looked at their tweets in general, and we also looked at their tweets that mentioned candidates in them or mentioned politics or parties. And what we found was actually kind of fascinating, which was that the political tweets actually got more attention on average than the non-political tweets. And I'm covering over some subtleties and nuances in here. The papers and perspectives on politics, anyone can go check it out. But that was the basic takeaway. They were not paying a penalty. If we think of, celebrities and social media as an attention economy and the way that they could get punished, like you could imagine if the sort of data generation process for how many likes Taylor Swift gets on a post is there's a 10% chance that one of her followers will like it. You could imagine that if she posts something that's, overtly political, even say two-thirds of her followers lean Democrat and 1/3 lean Republican, that should result in fewer numbers of tweets because the 1/3 that are Republicans aren't going to like it. And you would think that if 10% of the 2/3, who are Democrats would like it on the normal process, that would leave her with lower numbers because she would have lost the ones from the Republicans. That's not what we found. What we found is that when they talked about politics, they actually got more attention. So it actually, again, now this is the question the caveats here is we measured what we could measure and what we could measure was retweets. So from the standpoint of an attention economy, it did not seem that talking about politics got you less attention. We do not it would have been interesting to be able to see, like, did it lead to a drop in sales of records or something like that? Or I guess there's no records anymore. Downloads. Did it lead to a drop in merchandise? Those things would have been interesting. Within the context of social media, if we had known ahead of time we were going to do this study instead of doing it retrospectively, then what would have been interesting to see is if they lost followers after these political tweets. That we didn't have the data for. That's kind of complex data to get. You have to collect it in real time to get the numbers of followers over time. So for anyone who's thinking about sort of replicating our study, it would be super interesting to see, maybe you get a lot of retweets, but it costs you followers. But maybe it's the opposite. Maybe it's the same thing with the retweets. Maybe every time you tweet about politics, you draw in a bunch of other people who are like, oh, I didn't know Taylor was a Democrat. Like, of course I'll follow Taylor now on Instagram. So who knows?
But do you have any idea if the political takes of celebrities are influential in any way?
That I have no idea about. We haven't studied that. I mean, the most influential celebrities get, obviously, is when they actually run for office. We had Ronald Reagan, who was a movie star who became president of the United States. Donald Trump, was not a politician before he ran for office. He was a real estate developer, but he was a special brand of real estate developer in that he was a celebrity real estate developer. So, I mean, I think you could wonder, and I have not seen studies on this, about whether the rise of social media makes it easier for celebrities to attract political followings. But the caveat would be, Reagan was an actor. He wasn't a particularly good actor or a particularly well-known actor, but he was an actor. So it's like, we always want to be careful about drawing inferences from one example. Clearly, social media helped Donald Trump, get to the point where he could win the Republican nomination. The fact that 15 Republicans ran against him instead of the party sort of aligning on a chosen candidate also helped him, right? Like, I have no idea whether the celebrity helped him more than the 15 candidates helping them. In terms of celebrities being able to set issue agendas, right, which would combine our celebrity research with our Who Leads, Who Follows, agenda setting research, we haven't done that. I don't know. It's possible that other people have done it. And I have to certainly confess, like, I'm not an expert on celebrities by any stretch of the imagination. This is the only, we dabbled in this because we were interested in one specific question and we thought we had kind of cool data to test it. But there's a lot of people who do study celebrities and politics, so I would advise you to talk to one of them more about this topic.
Mm-hmm. What do you think about echo chambers? Is that really a thing online?
That is, as we say, the English expression, the $64,000 question, or the $64 million question, right? It's an absolutely huge question about the existence of echo chambers online. So we have to begin with that this is a term that's taken off, and it's not clear exactly what it means. There's a lot of different ways you could think about echo chambers, right? So on the one hand, there is, on sort of one end of the extreme, is this vision of people only associating with people online who are similar to them, who have similar political persuasions to them. I think that we clearly know is not the case for most people, right? As much as it, is difficult for people like you and me who are interested in politics to believe, if one thing we've learned from political science is that most people don't really pay that much attention to politics. Like, most people in the course of their daily lives are not thinking about politics. Lots of people only pay attention to politics around elections, and they only do that for short periods of time. Most people are perfectly content to go through their lives without thinking about politics, which means that there are a lot of reasons that people enter into networks on social media. And you enter into social media networks because you want to stay your family. And as we know, your family doesn't always has similar political persuasions, but there's sometimes people who don't. You enter into networks because you want to stay in touch with your friends from high school or your friends from university, right? Those people may not share your political persuasions. You enter into networks because you're staying in touch with your kids' parents. There's a lot of reasons why people enter into networks. So this extreme view, right, that people's activity on social media is 100% guided by politics, right, and that people only encounter people on social media who have the same political persuasion from them, is obviously incorrect. On the other hand, on the other side of the spectrum here, we also know that a homophily assumption turns out, and homophily is this desire to associate with people similar to you, this birds of a feather flock together. We have done a ton of research in our lab about whether or not you can predict political ideology from some simple homophily assumptions about people who have similar following patterns online, having similar political orientation. And so we know that these homophily assumptions generate useful data. And so we know, on average, that people do like to associate with people both online and offline who have similar political predispositions to themselves. And we know that there are times, unfollowing periods where this gets more serious, and there are times when it gets less serious. So I think the short answer to this is that if we want to think about this in terms of the networks in which people are embedded, right? I would say at this point, I would be very comfortable saying it is more likely that if you are left-leaning, more of your networks will be left-leaning, and you will be more likely to get news from left-leaning sources. You will be more likely to follow left-leaning politicians. Same thing is if you're right-leaning, you'll be more likely to get information from right-leaning. But if that's your definition of echo chambers, right? That people tend to associate with people of similar political persuasions, and especially when it comes to politicians they follow and news sources they follow and political elites, then yes, we certainly have a situation in the online world where people are going to find themselves. It's not this, panacea that we might think of as that you go online and suddenly you're exposed to equal levels of information from all sources. But nor is it likely to be the case on average, and I want to come back to this point in a second, on average, that when you're on these big platforms like Facebook and Twitter, that you are in hermetically sealed silos where you are not getting any other information other than from people who think exactly like you do. And there's a bunch of reasons for that. One reason is exactly what we were talking about before. People make their friends on Facebook for lots of different reasons, right? But another reason is that people don't live in single platforms. I mean, there's probably somebody out there who the only way they get news is from Facebook. They don't watch TV. They don't read newspapers. They're not on multiple platforms. But that's very unlikely, right? And so let me tell you about a couple different papers that we've done in a couple different research projects we've done at the Center for Social Media and Politics that speak to this. One thing we did was we had a paper about whether or not people live in filter bubbles, right? And we looked at combining people's Twitter followers. So we looked at people who tended to, we looked first at the distribution. And as we normally see, this distribution of what sort of political elites and what news sources you follow does sort of segregate people into right and left. Some people are in the middle. But even the people who are on the right will also report watching moderate TV stations, for example. And even people on the left, some of them will report, reading the Wall Street Journal, which is not a left of center publication. So when we begin to think about the real world and the real virtual world and combined with the real offline world, but the world in which people actually inhabit, it becomes a lot more complex and nuanced a picture. Another study that we did, which is called Tweeting from Left to Right, we actually looked at, this was actually one of the first papers we ever did in our lab, we looked at people's retweets on a wide variety of issues, ranging from very political issues. This goes back to the 2012 U.S. elections, right? Talking about the State of the Union address, talking during debates during the elections, to much less political issues like the Oscars or the Super Bowl. And we looked at the extent to which people on the left retweeted people from the left and people on the right retweeted people from the right. And what we found was interesting. So first off, again, on this sort of homophily assumption, if what you want to say is if you're going to define the echo chamber as anything that's not like people are equally likely to share information from anyone, anywhere, then yeah, we actually found that. In all of these cases, people on the left were more likely to be sharing information from people on the left. But in no cases was it hermetically sealed. Like the highest levels we saw was up to like a 75% versus 25%. But more interestingly, is that we found variation across these issues. So yeah, when it was a debate about the presidential election going on or the State of the Union address, we saw higher levels of this resharing of information from people who were similar to you. When it was about non-political issues like the Oscars or the Super Bowl, we saw much lower levels. Now, why is that interesting? It's interesting because if the question is, do people live in echo chambers online? Then the answer, then we have to be aware of this nuance that people are living, right, that they might be, you know, where they live online suggests everything they're doing online. And it seems that people are quite good at differentiating between political topics where they might want to be sharing people who are from more similar and other topics where they totally don't care. If you're following your favorite sports team and somebody posts something about a player they've signed, right? Like, it doesn't really matter to you. Well, so what does that mean for echo chambers? That's kind of up to the person who's asking the question to think about it. Maybe you don't care, right? That doesn't mean anything to you because all you really care about is, are they in an echo chamber when they're talking about politics? But when people talk about echo chambers, they sort of have this picture of these, you know, isolated communities. Well, if you're not isolated on other, you know, if you're not isolated on these other issues, you know, if you're not isolated on these other issues, that calls into question, is this an echo chamber? Now, I want to make a couple of caveats here, too, before we move on from this topic. Or if you want to keep talking about this topic, we can talk more about them. The first thing is that echo chambers on social media is a sexy idea, right? Everybody has an experience. You know, if you're politically active, right, you have an experience with seeing people who are also politically active. And we're all concerned about political polarization, so echo chambers seems like a super good explanation for why we end up getting political polarization in this country, or globally over the last years, and we can come back to that later. But it's also super important to be asking this question with baselines, right? Which is, do people live in more of an echo chamber offline than they do online? So I'm coming to you right now outside my window from, you know, Greenwich Village, Manhattan, where we elect the Democratic representative to Congress with a 90% of the vote, right? This hasn't been a contested seat ever. I mean, I'm sure at some point it was, but not in a long time, right? You know, I live in an area, in an urban area, which is very, very liberal, right? If I go 2 hours out of the city and drive into rural areas, they're very different, right? They're very, very conservative. And so as we begin to think about online echo chambers, we have to ask ourselves the somewhat difficult question, because it cuts against the grain of what people are thinking of, all right, well, relative to what? And let me tell you about another let me tell you about another interesting piece that we published recently in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, where the lead author was another PhD student, Naila Asimovich, who came up with this idea, who was interested in trying to understand the impact of Facebook on ethnic polarization. So a lot of the studies that have been done in the US, you know, this was interested in political polarization. She was interested in ethnic polarization. She's from Bosnia. And so we ran a study in Bosnia that's called a deactivation study, where we took people off of Facebook for a week. And this was a randomized control trial. So we asked people if they wanted to participate in the study, and then half the participants were randomly selected to deactivate Facebook for a week, and half the participants were chosen to stay on Facebook for that week. And we did this at a particularly salient moment of time in Bosnia's annual calendar, which is during the summer, when there's a commemoration of the Srebrenica genocide. And so a really highly salient point in interethnic relations and in the history of the Bosnian Civil War. And what we thought, right, based on these and I'm going to come back to this offline versus online. This gets into polarization, but we thought, based on the prevailing wisdom, that taking people off of Facebook, especially at this heated time, would ameliorate things, would make people less ethnically polarized. And we were looking at sort of attitudes towards outgroups. So for Bosniaks, attitudes towards Croats and Serbs, and vice versa. So what we found, though, oddly, was the opposite. We found that the people who were off social media for that week actually had more negative attitudes about ethnic outgroups. And this surprised us. It wasn't what we were expecting. It wasn't what we had thought from the literature. And so we tried to figure out what might be driving this. And what we did, and this is where it comes back to the question I was answering here, is that we looked at the difference between people's online experiences and their offline experiences. And what we began to think was, well, we had a question where we asked people who were in the experimental treatment of going off of Facebook, what did you do with the extra time? And the number one answer was spend time with friends and family. The number 2 answer was Instagram, but the number 1 answer was spend time with friends and family. So we started thinking, well, what happened? What might be going on here? Is it possible that by taking people off of Facebook and having them spend more time with friends and family, Bosnia is the ultimate example of these kind of geographically offline areas that are offline segregated for a terrible reason, right? Which is that there was ethnic cleansing during the Civil War. So we have people who live in very, very ethnically homogenous areas in Bosnia, and we have people who live in more ethnically mixed areas. And so we thought, you know, if this is what's happening, if what's happening is that we are pushing people off of Facebook, where they might have been exposed to divergent views, into situations where at the time of this commemoration, they're only talking to other Serbs, maybe that was what is pushing this result. And so we said, if that's right, we should see this effect, this negative effect, on people who live in these ethnically homogenous areas, but not see it in the people who live in the ethnically mixed areas. And sure enough, when we split the sample at that point into the more ethnically homogeneous and the less ethnic and the more ethnically heterogeneous, or the more segregated and the less segregated, we found the effect was entirely driven by people who were living in these offline areas that were heavily echo chambers, right? That were of the same ethnicity. And so that's the first caveat I want to make, that I think we have to be careful when we talk about online, because what we're realizing is that for some people, even if online communities are somewhat segregated in these kind of fluid ways we've talked about, that still might be the place where people get more exposure to people with different political perspectives than they do in their offline life. The second thing I want to mention is that everything I've been talking to you about here is kind of on average. And this is not to deny that there are not small subsections of the population that are in very, very tight echo chambers, right? We find time and time again through lots of different studies that when we look at behavior online, and particularly nefarious behavior online, it follows a power distribution, power law distribution, which is that we get small numbers of people that are heavily engaged in the behavior and that are responsible for lots and lots of the observed instances of the behavior, and large numbers of people that are, you know, barely involved at all. And so it may very well be the case that there are people who are in echo chambers online. And what I would push to think about, which again goes back to the data access issues, right, is that we may even, these most serious echo chambers may also be in non-mainstream platforms, in places where those of us who are doing research with Twitter data or running studies like I told you about on Facebook are not likely to find them, because they're on platforms like you were talking about January 6th, like Parler, which was active during January 6th, or Gab, which is known to, you know, right-wing, or Telegram, right, where things are encrypted and it can be much harder to sort of find people. So, and the last point I just want to make on this, because I've spent a lot of time saying, well, maybe echo chambers aren't as prevalent as we think. I want to be very clear that, again, there may be small numbers of people that are in pretty tight echo chambers online, and those may be very consequential, right? You don't need the whole country to be in echo chambers online to have 6,000 people decide to go to Washington, D.C., right, and take place in the 1/6 insurrection attempt, right? You don't need a ton of people to be in echo chambers if you have small communities of small anti-Semitic communities on Gab that are riling each other up, and somebody goes into a synagogue in Pittsburgh and shoots people, right? Like, so these things, despite maybe not being the normal experience for most people, it doesn't mean they can't have horrible and politically consequential effects.
Mm-hmm. So let's now get into the big question. Do we know if social media drive political polarization? I mean, do we know if there's any causal relationship there, and is it even possible to establish one?
If the other one was the $64,000 question, this is the $128,000 question, right? So I think you're going in the right direction here. So let me start by making an argument that it's really hard to establish any relationship, even though there's correlation there. And then let me talk to you a little bit about how I think we can begin to try to do causal relationships, but even why those are ultimately only going to show us a piece of the puzzle. Mm-hmm. So clearly, we are living in an era of heightened political polarization, in the United States anyway. A couple of years ago, I think we would have said this was the case in Europe. right? Rise of far-right groups, the death of the center. Although it seems like in recent elections in Europe, you know much better than I, that hasn't quite panned out as much as people thought it was going to pan out. Look, we could be having another conversation about President Marine Le Pen in a couple of years and looking differently. It seems like that maybe hasn't panned out quite as much. But there has been a rise in the far right, in advanced established democracies. You have the sort of takeover of the Republican Party in the United States by this. You have growing levels of what is called affective polarization. And just again, to explain to your listeners, just take a slight divergence here. When we talk about polarization as political scientists, we actually use that term to mean a couple of different but related things. One of which is what's called issue polarization. Whereas if you think of all of the issues that you could be, any issue you can put on a left-right spectrum. And you could think of a less polarized society when the parties are closer to the center on those issues. Their issues aren't that different. And a more polarized society when they're farther apart. So we think of the simplest thing as like, what should the marginal tax rate be? If two parties, one is saying 27% and one's saying 33%, that's a right party and a left party, but they're kind of close to each other. If one party's saying 12%, the other's saying 50%, that's much greater polarization on that issue. That's one type of polarization. That's what the word used to mean entirely when people use it in the vernacular. But now there's this term affective polarization, or sometimes people even call this political sectarianism, which is a particular subsect of affective polarization. But the idea of affective polarization is essentially how much supporters of one party dislike the other party. It's not necessarily about policy. It's about, like, would I be upset if my child married someone of this political persuasion? It's like literally those kinds of questions that we're getting into. And this political sectarian version of it, which is what a few of us tried to sort of introduce as a more kind of precisely defined term, this has to do with demonizing your opponent, using good versus evil kind of language in this as well, when you're thinking about this as kind of like a moral type question. Okay, so clearly in the United States, we're living in a period of rising affective polarization. And as I said, in Europe, it looked like this was the case too. We've also seen, some populist leaders with success in places like Brazil and the Philippines, kind of globally. All right. So this seems to be on the rise over the last, 10 to 15 years. The last 10 to 15 years coincides with the rise of social media, right? We have the launch of Twitter and Facebook in the 2000s. They take off as we get to the middle of the last decade, to these kind of incredible heights. So on face value, you have more social media, you have more political polarization. That looks like a relationship. But there are a lot of other things that have happened over that same period of time. Most importantly, we had the Great Recession of 2009, 2010, which was a global, massive economic downturn. We have had increasing trends in globalization that have led to subsections of the population losing jobs. One of the most interesting studies I ever saw showed that if you looked at how much of a county's, I think it was a county or a town's economy had been lost due to trade with China in the United Kingdom, it predicted people voting for Brexit, right? So there's economic dislocation that's taking place around globalization. We also had in Europe, right, we had the Syrian refugee crisis, right, which led to this influx of Syrian refugees on top of Afghan refugees, which then became a sort of lightning rod for politicians that wanted to make these kinds of arguments. And I can go on. And now we've got the COVID pandemic, right? So there are a lot of things that have happened over the past decade that we could look at and say, maybe these larger structural factors. In the United States, we have this ongoing and continued geographic sorting, right? Where younger people, liberal people, more ethnically diverse people are moving to cities. And older, whiter, more religious people are staying behind in more rural areas, or what we call exurbs, the sort of outer levels of suburbs. So we have a geographic sorting that's going on. I don't know if that's also happening in places of Europe, but like you have the rise of the cities as meccas for these sort of liberal things. So you have offline geographic sorting, which I think is super important and underappreciated here. So rise of social media coincides with rise of political polarization. It is quite possible that one is having an impact on the other, but it's hard to tell from looking at this kind of big picture over 12 to 15 years data. You certainly can't rule it out, but you certainly can't claim that it's definitely happening. All right. So what are other ways that you can do this? So the most exciting study that I've seen to try to figure out whether or not social media is causing political polarization are these kind of deactivation studies, the one that I was just telling you about that we ran in Bosnia. The reason we ran that in Bosnia is that Matt Genskow at Stanford and Hunt Olcott, formerly my colleague here at NYU in the economics department, now he's at Microsoft Research, ran a 1-month deactivation study in the United States where they looked at the effect of being off Facebook on 3 things: on people's social well-being, how good they felt, their knowledge of news, and on levels of political polarization. They found in their study that being off social media made people feel better about themselves, which is a super important subject of study in its own sense. They found it made them know less about the news, and it did seem to have an effect on lowering political polarization. We ran the replication study that we did in Bosnia, and we found the same thing that they found around social well-being. People felt better about themselves. We found that they also knew less about the news. But as I told you before, we found the opposite result around polarization, but we were looking at ethnic polarization. We then replicated that study in Cyprus in work that's still ongoing. But in that study, we found no effect on political polarization, on ethnic polarization in the context of Cyprus. So I think the jury's still absolutely out on this. And I think we need more of these kind of deactivation studies. And fortunately, I was part of a team leading a team of academics that worked collaboratively with Facebook to design studies around the 2020 US election. And one of the studies that we ran was a deactivation study. And in this big project that we were running, we had sort of 4 sets of key dependent variables that we were looking at. The impact of the mandate of this research project was to look at the impact of Facebook and Instagram in the context of the 2020 elections. And we picked out 4 topics, and one of those topics was political polarization. So we're going to be able to look, when these studies are done, we'll be able to have studies where we can look at the effect of going off of Facebook, again, replicating essentially the study that Matt and Hunt ran previously, but at a much larger scale. So we'll have more power. We'll be able to look at more heterogeneous treatment effects, how it affects different groups in society. And I think that will be a very important contribution to that discussion. That research is ongoing right now, but we're hoping that it's going to get published in the coming year. And I think that will add a lot to our knowledge of it. There are other experimental treatments that were ran during that study that will be able to tell us sort of more nuanced questions about whether different aspects of social media, like the nature of the algorithm or people's kind of friends networks and things like that, about whether that has an impact on polarization. So I think when those studies come out, we'll know a lot more about it. That then does loop back to the original point I was making about the sort of weird world of data access that we found ourselves in, which is that we were able to carry out these studies because we were able to work with Facebook to do this, which leads to the question of like, are these studies going to be able to be replicated in the future, right? They're expensive to run, right? They took a lot, when all is said and done, they will have taken a ton of effort on a lot of people's things. Will these be able to be replicated? Will Facebook be willing to do these kinds of studies in Europe? Will they be willing to do it for the 2024 US election? So there's still lots of outstanding questions about that, but I think we'll know a lot more about social media's impact on polarization when the results of those studies are through peer review and are released.
Okay, so one final question. How effective are social media in coordinating political actions, like, for example, political protest?
Yeah, so we think, this is what got me interested in social media in the first place. I was studying Russian elections, and there was a Russian election in 2011 where, despite the fact that I had been looking into what were known as the colored revolutions that had taken place in Serbia and Georgia, and Ukraine, and I had been, in a lot of meetings about these colored revolutions. Everyone said, "Oh, it'll never happen in Russia," and here's the 10 reasons why it's never going to happen in Russia. And if you define a colored revolution as overturning an election, it didn't actually happen in Russia. But we woke up after the 2011 Duma elections to discover that there were like 250,000 Russians on the street protesting electoral fraud. And I started asking around and said, like, what is this? I was asking my Russian friends, like, how did this come to be? Everyone said what's going to happen. And everyone kept talking about Facebook. And I think this is a case where we have, more evidence that there is, and we have very good theory to explain why we think social media would facilitate collective action, because it reduces barriers to coordination. We have really nicely kind of documented descriptive evidence. I wrote a piece with a grad student of mine, Megan Metzger, that was published in Slavic Review, where we kind of go through all the different things that were used, social media was used for during Euromaidan. We found Facebook groups that were coordinating getting hospital supplies to the Maidan. We found Facebook groups coordinating getting rides to come to Kiev during Euromaidan protests, right? Like, we have very good descriptive evidence of these kind of things. And there's been some nice kind of causal studies. So where people have used instrumental variable analysis to, for example, in Russia, a group of economists have used, Masha Petrova and Ruben Empelakov have used, had a study where they looked at Pavel Durov, who was the guy who founded VKontakte. They were able to look at who were his classmates when he was in college and introducing the platform, and found that those where his classmates came from in his year at college predicted more usage of social media 10 years later in Russia, and they could use, or 5 years later in Russia, and they could use then that as an instrument to predict where there was going to be more protest in the case when people were protesting against electoral fraud. So we have that kind of thing. I can tell you about we did what I think is a pretty interesting study at the Center for Social Media and Politics, where Jen Larsen, who's now at Vanderbilt, who was my colleague here at NYU when we worked on this, was the lead author on, and where we looked at the Charlie Hebdo protests. And the Charlie Hebdo protests, again, too often you say this when you do these kind of things, followed a tragedy, this tragic shooting at the Charlie Hebdo humor magazine in Paris. And there was an enormous rally in support of Charlie Hebdo, in support of freedoms, in support of all of these things at the time, shortly thereafter. And at that point, Twitter, and again, coming back to theory, why could we do this? We could do this because Twitter was making the data available. Twitter doesn't make this data available anymore. But at that point in time, for people who geolocated, Twitter was giving you latitude and longitude data on them, fairly precise. And so we could locate people who were at the protest and who were tweeting about the protest based on their geolocation. So what we did was we found about almost 1,000 people who were at the protest, tweeting about the protest using Charlie Hebdo hashtags, but we could locate them at being at the protest. And then we found another sample of people who were tweeting about Charlie Hebdo, had geolocation turned on their phones, used Twitter, so hopefully very similar to our population that was there, but we're more than 5 kilometers away in Paris. And we consider those people who could have been at the protest but chose not to be at the protest. And we actually got 1,000 people from France also outside of Paris doing the same thing in the days leading up to it, figuring those are people who could have come. Then what we did with this group of people, let's just focus on the 2 groups, the ones in Paris, the ones who were at the protest, the ones who weren't. We collected their 2-hop Twitter networks. So that meant we found everybody they followed, and then every person those people followed, which actually ended up bringing us to 140 million Twitter users across these 3 groups. And using those 2-hop networks, we were able to create all sorts of measures of how connected people were to other people at the protest. Like, did you follow someone at the protest? Did you follow someone who followed someone at the protest, right? Like, did someone you follow someone who followed someone who was at the protest? So there were all these kind of like weird, we looked at triangles, closed triangles, triangles, drawing on this kind of new field of network analysis. And we had a simple formal model in the paper, which just essentially formalized the argument, which is very intuitive, that you're more likely to go to the protest if you know someone who's going to the protest. But the way we figured out who knew people was exclusively based on Twitter followings. So if you think Twitter followings are sort of irrelevant to real life, then you could still believe people go to the protest if they know someone going to the protest, but it's because somebody called you, or you have a friend, or your roommate goes, or your spouse goes. We created our networks purely on Twitter, on who you followed on Twitter. So we made this purely about these kind of online networks that you were in. And then we compared the level of the size of, how many people did you know who were at the protest who you followed, to the people who were also in Paris, who didn't go to the protest. And we saw in their network of the thousand people we selected, how many of them knew somebody else who wasn't going, right? Like, and then we created all these different things, but we essentially had two networks of people, 1,000 people, all people who were interested enough in Charlie Hebdo to tweet about it, to be in Paris on that day. Some people who went and some people who didn't do. The people who went were more tightly connected on Twitter than the people who didn't go were tightly connected to each other. So we used the people who didn't go as our sort of control. What does 1,000 people who are interested in Charlie Hebdo, who are in Paris that day, look like in terms of a network? And the network was denser for the people who attended. We've subsequently replicated this. We did a study on the Women's March in the United States, which was much harder to pull off because it's like in 280 different places. And that paper is still in progress, but we replicated this sort of core finding that these networks mattered. So I think what we have is a sort of nice package of evidence here where we have very good micro-level theory about why social media helps people solve collective action problems. We have very nice descriptive evidence from the myriad of ways that people have used social media during protests in ways that are predicted by these theories. We have these kind of cool econ type aggregate level studies with instrumental variables, and we have our kind of computational social science studies that we've done with these kind of huge networks of big data analyses, and they all sort of point in the same direction. And then I think, as much as I hate, using anecdotes, our whole goal is to investigate things systematically, but it is worth asking yourself, like, does anybody organize a protest anymore without having a hashtag? Without having something on social media? I mean, I lived through the sort of return of the Black Lives Matter movement to the United States, and in the summer of 2020 there were protests, 5-6 protests going on daily in New York City. How do you find out where those protests was? They had an Instagram page. I mean, that's literally when we were there, and we were like, how do you find out where we're going to have a protest? It's just you go to this Instagram page, and every morning that Instagram page would post the locations of the protests, and everybody knew that's where you could find it. So it fits as well, I think, very much with, the world that we're observing around us. Could there be a future where people have protests without associating social media with it? I think only if you wanted to keep the protests private and you didn't want to let people know about it. But there are just so many things that so many ways that social media helps you if you want to engage in this kind of political participation, that I think this is one way that we can definitely say social media does, very much so does help to facilitate political protest. And it's probably, we won't see protests without people using versions of social media in the future very much at all.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so Dr. Tucker, just before we go, where can people find your work on the internet?
The easiest way to find my work on the internet, there are a few different ways. One, I have a Google Scholar page, so you can go to Google Scholar and just type in Joshua Tucker, and that will pop up published work. You can also go to the Center for Social Media and Politics website, which is CSMAP. So Center for Social Media and Politics, CSMAP, NYU for New York University. So just one thing, csmapnyu.org, where we have all of this, where we post all the papers that we have from the Center for Social Media and Politics, published papers with working papers that have been posted. And you can also find information. Sometimes we'll have information about work and research that's in progress there at CSMAP website. I also have a personal webpage, which you can get to just by Googling Joshua Tucker, where you can find my CV, which is hopefully usually relatively up to date with all of our publications and papers that are under review. But if you have questions, and if you're doing research, and if you're, for journalists out there who may be interested, who are doing studies or doing stories about social media and politics, and are interested in finding out if the Center for Social Media and Politics has relevant research for the stories they're working on, you can reach us. You can always email us at, I think it's csmap@nyu.edu, but let me just double check that. Yeah. CSMAP, CSMAP at nyu.edu for all sort of media and research inquiries, and we will get back to you, very quickly. We are super eager, and I'm very incredibly thankful for you, Ricardo, for doing this. We're really interested to have our research in the public discussion. so that as policymakers are considering reforms and regulations, they can do so based on rigorous evidence-based scientific research as opposed to what just is floating around in the punditry as the received wisdom. But also for members of the public, as they're making up their mind and trying to figure out what they think about these things, we're super eager to be part of the conversation and to have our research have a wider range in the public. So thank you very much for reaching out to me today, and that's super nice of you to offer to take the end to let me explain where people can find more about our research.
Yeah, of course. Thank you so much for taking the time to come on the show.
Great. It was a real pleasure. Thanks so much.
Hi guys, thank you for watching the interview until the end. If you like what I'm doing, please consider supporting the show. It's thanks to people like you that it keeps running. I will leave links in the description box to Patreon and PayPal. Any amount, even just $1 per month, would already be a great help. Otherwise, and if you like what I'm doing, please share the interview, leave a like and hit the subscription button. This show is brought to you by Enlights, learning and development done differently. Check their website at enlights.com. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters: KARIN, LIETZCKE, Anne Blanchette, Pererga Larsen, Lau Guerreiro, Francis Ford, Hans FREDRIK, SUNDE, RICARDO VLADIMIRO, Craig Healy, Adam Kessel, Olaf Alex, Jonathan VISSER, JAKOB KLINKBY, Matthew WHITINGBIRD, ARNAUD, WOLFF, Tim HOLLOSY, HENRIK, AHLENIUS, John Connors, PAULINA Baron, Philip Force Connolly, Jerry Muller, HERBERT, GINTIS, RUTGER Voss, Bo Weingard, Rebecca Newberger Goldstein, Dan Demetrio, Robert Windager, Rui Inácio, Arthur Coe, Zup, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Susan Pinker, Bernardo Seixas, Pablo Santurbano, Simon Columber, Jorge Espinha, Phil Kavanagh, Corey Clark, Mark Blythe, Roberto Inguanzo, Michael Stormir, Eric Neumann, Samuel Andreff, Tiago Nunes, Bernard Ugni, Alexander Dunbauer, Fergal Cusson, Evan Bodrenko, Al Herzog, Don Ross, Jonathan Librand, Oslan Bullitt, Nathan Nguyen, Stanton T, Samuel Correa, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, J.W., João Eira, Tom Hummel, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila DEZA-ARAUJO, Eden Solon, Romain Roach, Dmitry Grigoriev, Diego Londonio Correa, Tom Roth, Yannick Punter, Adana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavel Ostaszewski, Nelek Bach, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, Al Ortiz, Guy Madison, Gary G. Hellman, João Linhares, Lida Cosmidi, Sam Afzal, Adrian Yegi, Nick Golden, Paulo Tolentino, João Barbosa, Jules Price, Edward Hall, Edin Bronner, Franca Bortolotti, Gabriel Pons Cortez, Ursula Lietzcke, my producers: Izar Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafinia, Keon Gilligan, Luís Caetano, Tom Vanagdam, Curtis Dixon, João Linhares, Benedict Muller, Vega Guidi, Sardas France, and Thomas Trumbull, and my executive producers: Michel Rugieski, Rosie, James Pratt, Matthew Lavender, Sergio Quadriano, and Bogdan Kanivets. Thank you for all.